He died, and she went up to the attic for the first time in 30 years. In an old box lay his secret camera, but when she developed the film, her world was turned upside down. Subscribe and write which city you are watching from. Helen Carter had never imagined that the quiet town of Maple Hollow, tucked between the cold hills of northern Vermont, could feel so unbearably silent. Yet after the funeral of her husband, Henry Carter, silence became the only sound she heard. It filled the wide, creaking hallways of their old Victorian house, settled into the seams of the floral wallpaper, hovered above the wooden banister he had polished every spring. Even the ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room, once a comforting rhythm of their shared life, now struck with a hollow, almost mocking persistence. Days after Henry was laid to rest, beneath a thin layer of cold November soil, the house stood unchanged, but Helen felt as though she had stepped into another version of it, one built from memories instead of the present. She moved through the rooms slowly, touching the objects he had left behind, as if they might still carry the warmth of his hands, the coffee mug he always forgot on the dresser, the jacket draped over the chair in the mudroom, the boots still dusted with dried leaves. Everywhere she looked, she found him. And yet, everywhere she went, he was gone. People from town did what people in small towns always did. They brought food casseroles, pies, loaves of bread wrapped in clean kitchen towels. They filled her kitchen counters with enough meals to last weeks, talking softly, offering condolences with practiced tenderness. But beneath the kindness, Helen sensed something else, something unspoken. A few neighbors lingered too long at the door, their eyes drifting across the hallway behind her, as though searching for something. Others clasped her hands with a sympathy that felt weighted, as though they were mourning more than Henry's death. She told herself she was imagining it, that grief distorted everything. That was easier than believing people knew something she didn't. For 30 years, she had been married to Henry, a man of few words but steady presence, a man who woke before dawn, kissed her on the forehead before leaving for the fire station, and returned home smelling faintly of smoke and pine. He was not a man who shared stories of his past. He preferred to talk about the weather, or the broken heater in the firehouse, or the rising cost of fuel. She never pressed him. They lived in an ordinary rhythm-quiet dinners, weekend drives, autumn fairs at the town square. She believed, without question, that she knew him. It was only after his death that she realized how little she truly did. A week passed before Helen found the strength to open his closet. His shirts hung in perfect order, as though he might walk back in and choose one at any moment. She ran her fingers along the sleeves, feeling the soft cotton worn thin at the elbows. She folded his clothes with trembling care, placing them in boxes bound for donation, and paused only when she found the small notebook he used during his years as a firefighter. The cover was stiff and cracked with age. Inside were neatly written notes about fire calls, dates, and addresses, but whole pages had been torn out. Names were scribbled over. Certain dates were circled in red. She stared at the strange marks, unsettled by the realization that Henry had kept secrets, even in something as mundane as a work notebook. The discovery lingered in her mind, long after she closed the closet doors. 2 days later, wanting distraction, Helen climbed the steep staircase to the attic for the first time in decades. Henry had always told her not to bother with it. "Nothing but junk up there," he used to say with a dismissive wave of his hand. But something in his tone, remembered now through the haze of grief, had always sounded less like dismissal and more like warning. At the top of the stairs, she pulled the chain that turned on the single bulb overhead. A dusty yellow light filled the room, revealing a lifetime of forgotten things. Boxes were stacked in uneven piles, some collapsing under their own weight. Old holiday decorations sagged in open bins. A broken typewriter sat beside a rusted birdcage. The air was thick with dust, motes swirling through the beam of the light like drifting snow. Helen moved carefully between the stacks, brushing dust from the lids to read the faded labels. Christmas, 1982. Tools. Henry's books. Old clothes. The attic smelled of old wood and paper, a scent that pulled something nostalgic and bittersweet from deep inside her chest. She remembered the first time she and Henry stepped into this house, newly married and full of hope. He had promised to renovate the attic one summer, make it into a studio for her painting hobby. That summer never came. Near the far corner of the attic, half hidden behind a large suitcase, she noticed something out of place. A long, narrow wooden box, unlike any of the others. The wood was dark and smooth, carved with a precision that didn't match the worn objects around it. Dust had gathered thickly across its surface, but there were faint streaks where someone had brushed it away recently. Helen frowned. She hadn't been in the attic in years. Henry, as far as she knew, hadn't been here either in a very long time. She pulled the box into the light. A small brass key hung on a thin string tied around the latch, as though waiting for her, and on the lid, burned neatly into the wood, was a date. 1979. She froze. The year was long before she ever met Henry, a year he never spoke about, a year missing from every one of the stories he had reluctantly shared over their 3 decades together. Her fingers trembled as she fit the key into the lock. The mechanism clicked softly, resisting for only a moment before giving way. She lifted the lid. Inside, cushioned by a folded cloth, lay a vintage Kodak film. Camera clean, polished, perfectly preserved. It looked as though it had been placed there yesterday. Beside it were 4 film rolls, each one labeled in Henry's handwriting. Beneath them sat a single piece of paper, folded once. Helen unfolded it with delicate care. "Please," the note read, "don't develop these until I'm gone." The handwriting was unmistakably Henry's. Her breath caught in her throat. She sank to her knees, staring at the contents as though they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Henry was not a man who took photographs. He always said he preferred to live moments instead of capturing them. They owned a cheap camera somewhere, used only for a couple of vacations. But this was something entirely different. This was purposeful, personal, secret. She lifted the camera. It felt heavier than she expected. When she pressed it against her palm, a faint scent of smoke clung to the leather strap. Not fresh, smoke old, embedded, like the scent of a fire that happened long ago but never truly vanished. The films were labeled with dates. Some matched the torn pages from Henry's notebook. Others were dates she didn't recognize at all. Her heart pounded as she pieced together the implication. These photos were part of whatever past Henry never wanted to speak about. Yet he had kept them, hidden them, and left them for her to find. Helen sat there for a long time, the cold attic air settling around her as she stared at the box. 1,000 questions crowded her thoughts. Why had he hidden the camera? What was on the films? Why had he asked her not to develop them until he was gone? And perhaps most frightening of all, who else knew this box existed? The disturbed dust, the faint footprints near the corner, the odd glances from neighbors, none of it seemed like coincidence anymore. She closed the box gingerly, her decision forming before she fully understood it. Whatever Henry had done, whatever he had been afraid of, she needed to know. Needed to understand the man she had lived beside for most of her life. Helen stood, carrying the box down the narrow attic stairs with careful steps. In the living room, she set it on the coffee table and stared at it one last time. Then she picked up her coat, slipped the films into her purse, and walked out into the sharp November air. She headed toward the small photo lab on Main Street. By the time she reached the sidewalk, one thought repeated in her mind, steady and unwavering. Henry had kept a secret for 30 years. Now it was her turn to uncover it. The next morning brought a thin mist that clung low to the ground, washing the already pale streets of Maple Hollow in a colorless haze. Helen stepped outside with her purse pressed close to her side, the film rolls inside feeling heavier than they should have, as though they carried the full weight of the past she had never been allowed to see. The old Victorian house loomed behind her, tall and silent, its shutters rattling softly in the morning wind. She hesitated for only a moment before locking the door and starting down the quiet street toward Main, the soles of her shoes crunching lightly over the frosted leaves. The town was just waking up. A few people were sweeping storefronts, shaking out rugs, or turning signs from closed to open. Cars passed occasionally, their tires whispering across the asphalt. A man walking his dog paused to nod politely at Helen, though his eyes lingered on her longer than necessary. She wondered if he'd heard she had been in the attic yesterday. In a place as small as Maple Hollow, news had a way of traveling faster than truth. The photo lab sat between the bakery and the barber shop, its faded awning drooping over the windows like a tired eyelid. Inside, the warm yellow glow was a comforting contrast to the cold outside. As she stepped in, a bell chimed overhead, and the familiar scent of chemical developer and old paper met her like an old friend. Behind the counter, Neil Arbance was polishing his glasses with the same soft cloth he had used for decades. He looked up, offering her a small, practiced smile. He had the kind of face that seemed carved out of experience, deep lines around the eyes, a firmness to the jaw, and the weary expression of someone who had seen too much of other people's intimate moments through the photographs they trusted him with. "Well, good morning, Helen," he said, slipping his glasses back on. His smile faded slightly when he saw her expression. "You all right?" She nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure that she was. "I brought some old films," she said, placing them gently on the counter. "I found them in the attic." Neil picked up one of the rolls and rotated it slowly between his fingers. His brows knit together as he read the handwritten label. Henry's handwriting, bold and unmistakable. "I didn't know Henry still had any of these," he murmured. Then he looked up at her again, eyes narrowing in something like cautious concern. "These are older than most folks bring in. Might take a little time." "That's fine," she replied quietly. "I just want them developed." His expression shifted, the smile entirely gone now, replaced by something guarded. "Helen, did Henry ever tell you about the Johnson fire? Or 1987 in general?" She blinked, startled. "No. Why?" But Neil shook his head and waved a dismissive hand, clearly regretting the question. "Never mind. It's just, these films, they're from around that time. You know I'll do a good job with them. Just be prepared. Sometimes old photos bring up things that were left alone for a reason." Her chest tightened. She forced a small nod. "I'll come back tomorrow." When she left the store, the bell chimed again behind her, but Neil didn't call out the usual goodbye. She felt his eyes follow her until she turned the corner. The rest of the day passed in uneasy fragments. She tried cleaning the house, sorting through Henry's belongings, making tea she never finished. But her thoughts drifted constantly to the box on the coffee table, the clouded glass of the camera lens reflecting the room around it like a single unblinking eye. Several times she reached for the notebook with the torn-out pages, reading and rereading the dates, searching for connections that refused to reveal themselves. That night, she barely slept. Her dreams were patchworks of smoke, fire, and a shadowy figure holding a baby. She woke before dawn, heart pounding, convinced She had heard a door close somewhere in the house, but when she checked, everything was as it had been. The next morning she returned to the photo lab, her stomach twisted into a knot so tight she felt almost nauseous. The bell chimed again when she entered, but this time Neil didn't look up from the counter. The photos were already laid out in a neat stack, face down, as though waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to look at them. When he finally lifted his head, his expression was heavy with apology. "Helen, I think you should sit down." She did, her pulse thudding in her ears. Neil slid the stack toward her, but kept one hand resting on top of it, holding it in place for a moment. "I didn't know everything about Henry. None of us did. But I think these might answer questions you never thought to ask." He finally let go. Helen swallowed hard and flipped over the first photograph. Her breath left her in a slow, trembling exhale. It was a burning house. No, not just burning, fully collapsing. The flames tearing through the roof in wide, violent tongues. But the real shock wasn't the fire. It was the figure inside the structure. Through the shattered frame of a doorway, illuminated by the blaze, stood Henry. He held something in his arms, something wrapped in cloth, but his face was turned slightly away, obscured by smoke. The timestamp printed in the corner showed it had been taken minutes before the official fire report she had once skimmed in his old notebook. Henry was inside the house before the fire crew arrived. He had always said he got there too late, that there was no one left to save. The second photo hit her even harder. A young woman sat on a bed in a dim room, her expression lost between exhaustion and fear. She held a baby close to her chest. On the back of the photograph, written in Henry's unmistakable handwriting, was a name, Nora, and a date, 1989. The baby looked only a few months old. The woman's face bore a bruise under her right eye. The room in the background wasn't a hospital room. It looked like a makeshift shelter. A bare window, peeling wallpaper, an oil lamp on a crate beside the bed. Helen's heart hammered as she flipped to the next photo. It showed a small cabin nestled in the woods outside Maple Hollow, a place she had seen only in passing during autumn hikes. Henry stood in the doorway of the cabin, his posture protective but wary. The young woman, Nora, was beside him, the baby in her arms. She wasn't smiling. Neither was Henry. The fourth photograph was taken in a hospital corridor. It showed Henry carrying the same baby, but he was looking over his shoulder, as though startled by something or someone. The corridor was dim, the lights flickering, and the timestamp placed it in the middle of the night. Helen felt the room spinning slowly around her. The fifth photo was the most unsettling. It was not a photograph of a person or a scene, but of a document one page taken from a fire investigation report. The name Nora Jackson appeared near the top, then a line beneath it. Husband deceased. Cause of fire under investigation. The final scribble at the bottom, written in a different pen, read, "Missing." She stared at the photos long after she'd seen them all, her mind desperately trying to build a barrier between the images and what they implied. For 30 years, she had built a life with Henry, trusting him entirely. And yet, here, on glossy paper in her shaking hands, was proof of a story he had never told her. A story about a young woman, a child, a fire, and a desperate attempt at escape. "Did Henry ever say anything about this?" she whispered, hardly daring to meet Neil's eyes. "No," he said quietly. But the whole town knew something happened back then. Nobody knew details, though. He never spoke of it. Never. Not to anyone. When she stepped back out onto Main Street, the cold air felt sharper, biting at her cheeks. People passed her, offering polite nods, but she imagined she saw a flicker of something else in their eyes. Recognition, maybe guilt, maybe pity. She wasn't sure which was worse. As she walked, the images haunted her. Why had Henry been in that burning house before the fire crew arrived? Who was Nora? Whose child was that? Why had Henry photographed a police report? And why had he gone to such lengths to hide any trace of this chapter of his life? She reached the house in a fog of disbelief. The old Victorian felt different now, less like a sanctuary and more like a carefully curated stage, set built around a life that had never been real. She placed the photos on the dining table and spread them out like puzzle pieces, as though arranging them might reveal something hidden between their edges. Hours passed. She barely noticed the light fade outside, or the cold creeping into the room. She studied every detail of the photographs, the background objects, the shadows, the angles, the dates, searching for clues the way Henry must have once searched through debris after a fire, hoping to find the truth in what remained. By late evening, she could no longer ignore the knot in her chest, the sense that she had only begun to uncover something far larger than she had expected. She knew what she had to do next. If she wanted answers, real answers, not guesses or assumptions, she needed to find the woman in the photographs. Nora Jackson. Helen gathered the photos carefully, her movements slow and deliberate. She placed them back into the envelope, then stored it in the drawer of the hall table, as though hiding a dangerous spark away from dry kindling. Her hands shook faintly as she closed the drawer. The photographs had undone Henry's story, every part of the past he had shaped for her. Now she had no choice but to follow the threads he had left behind, even if they led her into places she had never imagined going. As she turned off the lights and climbed the stairs toward her bedroom, she knew sleep would not come easily. The images of fire and fear and secrecy burned behind her closed eyes, and with them came a single, painful truth. Whatever kind of man Henry truly was, she had only just begun to find out. And tomorrow, she would begin searching for the woman he had protected from the flames. The next morning arrived wrapped in a dull gray light, the kind of soft, subdued brightness that offered no warmth and no comfort. Helen woke feeling as though she had slept under the weight of 100 blankets, her limbs heavy, her thoughts even heavier. The photographs she had left in the hall drawer seemed to pulse through the house, like a memory refusing to fade. She lay still for a long moment, listening to the faint creaks and sighs of the old Victorian structure around her, before forcing herself upright. There was no escaping what she had seen, and there was no escaping what she had to do. She needed answers that only the past, and the people still tangled in it, could give her. She went downstairs and made coffee she did not drink, brewed out of habit rather than desire. The house felt colder than usual, though she knew the thermostat had remained unchanged. She looked toward the hall drawer where the envelope rested, and then looked away just as quickly. Questions formed in her mind, before she even touched the handle. Who was Nora, really? Was she a victim, or something more complicated? What had happened the night of the fire? And why had Henry taken such risks to protect her? It was not merely the shock of discovering another woman in his past. It was the realization that he had built a silent wall within their marriage, a partition where he kept this entire story locked away. She finally opened the drawer, removed the envelope, and placed it under her arm as she walked out the door. The morning air struck her with its sharp crispness, and for a moment she stood on the porch, letting the cold bite her skin awake. Then she descended the stairs and headed toward the street, each step hesitant but determined. She knew exactly where she needed to begin. The documents and photographs pointed toward a single place, a forgotten address scribbled on the back of one of the film rolls, a place she had never visited, an old neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The drive there took her along winding roads lined with bare trees, whose branches stretched like brittle fingers toward the slate sky. The houses in that part of town had long lost their charm-peeling paint, sagging porches, windows boarded up or cracked. When she reached the address, she saw immediately that the house had not been lived in for decades. The yard was overgrown, a tangle of wild bushes and leafless vines that crept across the crumbling porch. The windows were covered in grime so thick they reflected no light. The door hung crookedly on a rusted hinge. A woman from across the street watched Helen approach. She stood on her porch with a broom in her hand, but had stopped sweeping the moment Helen pulled up. Helen felt the weight of the woman's stare and decided she might know something. She stepped back from the ruined house and crossed the road. "Excuse me," Helen called gently. "Do you know who used to live here?" The woman hesitated, then lowered the broom and walked slowly toward the edge of her porch. She was older, perhaps in her 70s, her hair a thin halo of white around her lined face. She looked at Helen as though studying whether she could be trusted with the truth. "That place," the woman said, nodding toward the decaying structure. "No one's lived there since the fire." "The fire?" Helen asked, though she already suspected she understood. The woman's expression grew somber. "The Jacksons. Young couple. The husband drank, mean as a rattlesnake. The wife, Nora, poor thing. Sweet girl, but trapped with him. Folks around here heard things, saw things. But back then, people didn't interfere in other people's homes the way they might today." Helen felt her heartbeat quicken. "Do you know what happened to her?" "Oh, everyone knows what happened to her," the woman replied. "But nobody really knows, if you understand what I mean. One night the house caught fire. Big flames. Took forever for the firefighters to get it under control. They found the husband's body inside. Burned. But Nora? She wasn't there. Some said she started the fire. Others said she ran for help and never came back. One man claimed he saw a truck leaving real late that night, headed toward the woods. But rumors are all we ever had." Helen swallowed. "Did anyone ever mention Henry Carter?" The woman's eyes sharpened with an almost imperceptible flicker of recognition. "You're Henry?" "Well, he was one of the first on the scene. People said he looked shaken afterward, more than usual. But he hardly talked to anyone about it, not even at church. Then a few weeks later, the house got boarded up and Nora was officially labeled missing. After that, the whole thing just faded into town history." Helen thanked the woman and walked back to her car, her heart racing. She sat behind the wheel for several minutes without starting the engine. Henry had been there. He had saved Nora, somehow. In some way he never confessed. And if the old rumors were true, that someone saw a truck leaving right after the fire, it was possible that Henry had been the one driving it. The next person she needed to speak to was Tom, Henry's older brother. She had always avoided Tom. He'd been present at the wedding and a few family gatherings early on, but his drinking and temper made every interaction uncomfortable. He lived in a beat-up trailer on the farthest edge of town, near the old quarry, where he did sporadic seasonal work. Helen drove there reluctantly, the landscape changing from suburban decay to wide stretches of brown grass and gravel pits. Tom's trailer looked as though it had survived more storms than it should have. The siding was dented, the steps sagged, and an old pickup truck sat rusted in the dirt. When Helen knocked, the door opened only halfway, catching on a chain lock. Tom peered out, squinting as though the daylight offended him. His face had the rough, weathered quality of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors and the rest of it in bars. "Tom," Helen said softly, "it's me. I need to talk to you. About Henry." Tom grunted, shut the door just long enough to undo the chain, then opened it fully. Without a word, he turned and walked inside, leaving her to close the door behind him. The interior smelled of whiskey, cigarette smoke, and stale air. But Helen forced herself to sit in the frayed recliner he gestured toward. Tom dropped heavily into a chair across from her and stared at her with bloodshot eyes. "I found something," she began, clutching her purse tightly. Up in the attic. A camera. Some photographs. From 1987 and 1989. Tom, I need to know what happened. For a long moment, Tom didn't move. Then he sighed, rubbed his face with both hands, and leaned back with a resigned expression. I figured this day might come, he said. Henry carried things he never should have carried. He tried to bury them deep. But secrets don't stay buried. Not in a town like this. Helen waited, afraid to breathe too loudly. Tom began slowly, his voice thick. Back in '87, when the Jackson place went up in flames, Henry was off duty. But he heard the call on the scanner and drove straight there, faster than anyone else. The house was a mess by the time he got inside, and he found her. Nora barely conscious, half smothered from the smoke. She was beat up bad. Not from the fire, you understand me. Helen did understand, and the realization chilled her. He didn't wait for the others, Tom continued. He carried her out and put her in the back of his truck. Said he needed to get her help. But he didn't take her to the hospital. She begged him not to. Told him if the authorities found her, they'd take her baby once it was born. And they'd say she killed her husband, even though everyone in town knew that man could have set the fire himself. What about the baby? Helen whispered. Tom hesitated. Born a few months later. Henry helped bring him into the world. He was proud, in a way. Said he couldn't let the kid end up in foster care. Said the boy deserved a fresh start. Nora stayed hidden in that old cabin for almost a year. Then she got into a program out of state for abused women. New name, new life. Henry. He made sure she stayed safe. Helen closed her eyes. The picture of Henry in the cabin made painful sense now. She saw the tenderness behind the secrecy, the agony behind the silence. He hadn't betrayed her. He had protected someone who had nobody else. Why didn't he tell me? She asked, her voice trembling. Tom looked at her with a mix of pity and regret. Because he knew you. Knew you lived by rules and truth and clean lines. And he loved you too damn much to bring that mess into your home. He figured if you knew he'd lied, broken laws, hidden things, you'd walk away. And losing you would have destroyed him. Tears blurred her vision. She looked down, unable to speak. Tom stood, walked to a small drawer, and returned with something folded in his hand. He held it out. It was a final photograph, the one Helen had not yet seen. Henry stood beside Nora and a teenage boy, around 15 years old, tall and thin, with Henry's steady posture, but none of his features. The background was a park bench, sunlit and peaceful. Nora was smiling. Henry was smiling too genuinely, not the faint, reserved smile he so often had at home. He looked proud. When was this taken? She whispered. About 7 years ago, Tom said. They reached out to him once, just once. Wanted him to know they were okay. Helen held the photograph to her chest, overwhelmed by the life Henry had lived in silence. Tom lowered himself back into his chair. He did what he thought was right. Maybe not legal. Maybe not clean. But right. Helen stayed a while longer, asking quiet questions, receiving heavy answers. By the time she left the trailer, the sky was beginning to darken, a purple-gray wash stretching across the horizon. She drove slowly, the photograph resting on the seat beside her, her thoughts a storm of grief, anger, love, and something deeper understanding. She returned home and placed all the photos on the dining table, studying them again. This time she saw them differently, not as symbols of betrayal, but as windows into a part of Henry she had never known, a part defined not by infidelity or deception, but by compassion, courage, and impossible choices. She saw the young woman hiding from a violent husband. She saw the infant born into danger. She saw the burned-down house, the cabin, the hospital corridor. She saw Henry, her Henry, doing whatever he could to help, even if it meant breaking the rules or breaking himself. As she sat in the silence of the dining room, surrounded by the truth he never told her, Helen understood the next step with painful clarity. There was one more person she had to find. One more truth waiting for her beyond the borders of Maple Hollow. Nora was still out there, living under a new name, raising a son who had been born in fear and saved by the man who had been her husband. If Helen wanted closure, real closure, she had to find Nora herself. And so, with the photographs gathered in a single envelope and her heart heavy but resolute, she prepared to face the last unfinished piece of Henry's secret past. Helen woke before dawn, stirred by the kind of restlessness that comes from knowing that a final, irrevocable decision lies ahead. She lay in bed for a long time, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling in the half-dark, listening to the hum of the furnace and the occasional groan of the old house settling against the cold. The photographs from Henry's past were spread across the dining table downstairs, as though the truth they contained had seeped into the very structure of the home, filling every corner with a heaviness she could neither ignore nor escape. The day before had brought clarity, but clarity did not bring peace. Instead, it pressed on her like a weight that would only lighten when she decided what to do with what she now knew. She rose, wrapped herself in her robe, and descended the stairs slowly, gripping the railing for support. The dining room felt colder than usual, the windows fogged with condensation from the frigid night. The photographs lay exactly where she had left them, though in the dim light they seemed different. Not accusations, not betrayals, but artifacts of a life lived in complexity and impossible choices. She stood at the table, her hands resting lightly on the chair backs, and let her eyes drift from one image to another. Henry holding the baby in the hospital corridor. Nora with bruises shadowing her face, the burned house lit by flames, the cabin hidden in the woods, and finally, the most recent photo. Henry beside Nora and the teenage boy, a moment captured years after the fire, long after the chaos had faded. She drew a long, shaky breath. She needed to speak to Nora. It was the last connection left, the last missing piece of understanding that would let her grasp the full truth of who her husband had been, and what he had carried silently beside her all those years. Finding Nora required patience and determination. Tom had given her a few clues, a state, a type of program, vague hints about the new life Nora had built. It took hours of searching through old news articles, support centers for survivors, archived assistance programs, and public records with altered names. But bit by bit, Helen pieced together enough threads to follow a trail out of Vermont and into a neighboring state, to a quiet suburban neighborhood far from Maple Hollow. The drive was long and gave her too much time to think, the miles passing beneath her tires in a blur of winter-gray landscape and bare trees. The world seemed muted, as though the sky itself was holding its breath. She found Nora's house in a modest development, lined with identical homes, painted in soft earth tones. The yard was tidy, the driveway clear of snow, the windows glowing faintly with warm lamplight. It was the kind of home built for safety, for new beginnings, for people who needed to believe the world could still be kind. Helen parked across the street and sat gripping the steering wheel, struggling to steady her heartbeat. She had no idea how Nora would react. She had no idea what she herself would say or how much to reveal, but she knew she couldn't turn back. Finally, she stepped out of the car and walked toward the house. Her boots crunched softly on the thin layer of snow. When she reached the front door, she lifted her hand, and knocked, her knuckles brushing lightly against the painted wood. The door opened after a few moments, revealing a woman in her late 40s. Nora's hair was slightly lighter than in the photographs, and lines had formed around her eyes, the kind that came from years of holding back tears and then learning to smile again. Her expression shifted quickly, from confusion to recognition, and then to a guarded caution. "Helen," she said softly, as though tasting the name before fully believing it. I didn't expect." She trailed off, glancing behind Helen as if checking for danger, then stepping aside. "Please come in." Inside, the house was warm and inviting. Soft music played from a radio in the kitchen. A framed photo of a young man, likely her son, stood on a side table, his smile bright and confident. Helen felt a pang in her chest, imagining Henry seeing that same smile and feeling that rare, unguarded joy. They sat in the living room, opposite one another. Nora folded her hands tightly, her shoulders tense, waiting. "I found the photographs," Helen said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "In Henry's things, the ones he took of you, of the baby, of the fire." Nora exhaled sharply, her eyes glancing down as though she had been punched. She nodded slowly. "I wondered if he still had them. I told him he should destroy everything, but he said he couldn't. He said they were proof that I wasn't crazy. Proof that he hadn't made it all up." Helen shook her head. "He didn't tell me any of it. Not a single thing." Nora closed her eyes briefly, regret and gratitude mixing across her expression. "He didn't tell anyone. He thought that was the only way to keep us safe." Helen studied Nora, seeing not just the frightened young woman from the photos, but someone tempered by survival, steadied by years of rebuilding. "Tom told me everything," Helen said, "about the fire, the cabin, the birth of your son, about how Henry helped you disappear." Nora's eyes filled with tears, though they didn't spill. "I owe him my life, and my son's life. Without Henry, I would have died in that house. My husband, Mark, he was in one of his rages. He set something on fire in the kitchen. It got out of control so fast. I tried to get out, but he grabbed me, hit me, dragged me back." Her voice trembled. "Henry found me barely conscious. He carried me out. He didn't wait for the others. He just took me." Silence stretched between them, thick with memories. "Why didn't you ever contact him again?" Helen asked, not accusatory but searching. Nora looked up, her gaze clear and filled with sorrow. "He told me not to. He said if I ever reached out, it could ruin everything. For me, for my boy, and for you. He said you deserved a life free from the chaos he had stepped into when he helped me. And he didn't want to drag you into the consequences of something he couldn't undo." Helen felt tears sting her own eyes. The image of Henry smiling beside Nora in that last photograph seemed to shift, replaced now with an understanding of the burden he had carried, not out of deceit, but out of love for all involved. "He loved you," Nora said gently. "He talked about you. Even in those early months, he said you were the best thing that ever happened to him, and that he couldn't lose you." Helen swallowed. "He didn't lose me," she said softly. "But he didn't tell me the truth either. Not any of it." Nora nodded. "He thought it would break your trust. And maybe he was right. Maybe he just didn't know how to reconcile the man you saw with the man he felt he had to become to protect us." They sat together, two women connected by a man who had tried and failed to divide his life into pieces that would never overlap. After a long pause, Nora wiped her eyes and stood. She returned with a small tin box, which she placed gently on the coffee table between them. "These were his too," she said. "He gave them to me years ago. Letters he wrote while I was hiding in the cabin. Reports he copied so I'd know the truth if anything happened to him. She closed the lid gently. I think they belong to you now. Helen reached out but hesitated, her fingers brushing the lid. She understood how heavy the responsibility was, not just the objects, but everything they meant. Before either woman could speak again, a sound came from the hallway, a soft thud and hurried footsteps. A tall young man appeared in the doorway. He stopped when he saw Helen, puzzled. His hair was dark, his features sharp and earnest, and his eyes were familiar, though not because they resembled Henry's. They resembled courage. They resembled survival. This is my son, Nora said quietly. His name is Daniel. Daniel offered a polite nod. Hi, sorry. I didn't know we had company. Helen nodded back, unable to find words for a moment. She was looking at the grown child Henry had once carried through a hospital hallway, under flickering lights, the baby he had risked everything to protect. And Daniel, unaware of the weight of the decades that connected them, disappeared into another room, leaving only the echo of possibilities behind him. When the door closed, Nora turned back to Helen. What are you going to do with the photographs? Helen looked down at her hands, folded tightly in her lap. I don't know, she admitted. The police are starting to ask questions. They know I've been looking into Henry's past. If they get the photos, they'll reopen the investigation. They'll drag your name through everything again. Nora's face paled. Helen, I can't survive that again. And Daniel, he has no idea what happened before he was born. He's built his whole life on being free from that man's shadow. If this comes out, Helen reached across and took Nora's hand, surprising them both. I don't want to hurt you or your son, but I also don't want to erase what Henry did. He saved you. He saved Daniel. He wasn't perfect, but he was good. Nora squeezed her hand. Then let him be remembered for that, at least by those who need to know. When Helen left the house, the sky was beginning to shift into late afternoon, a muted orange brushing the horizon. She drove back to Maple Hollow silently, her mind turning over everything she had learned, everything she now held in her hands. The town seemed unchanged as she returned. Quiet streets, shuttered homes, smoke drifting from chimneys. But she felt changed, as though she had been given a lens through which to see Henry, not only as the man she had married, but as the man he had once been before her. At home, she placed all the photographs, all the documents, all the letters in the center of the dining table, forming a single, painful collection of truth. She sat in the silence that followed, feeling the gravity of the decision settling into her bones. She understood now. There were two paths. The first, give everything to the police. Let the truth come out officially, decades late, with all the wounds it would reopen. Nora would lose her new identity. Daniel would lose the life built from safety. Henry would be exposed for the crimes he committed, even if they were committed in the service of saving others. The second, destroy the evidence. Protect Nora. Protect Daniel. Let Henry's secret die with him. But carry the knowledge herself, living with the truth quietly, privately, honoring him in a way the world never would. For a long time, she sat motionless, listening to the house breathe around her. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, she gathered the photographs and documents into a small pile. She carried them to the fireplace, knelt on the cold hearth, and struck a match. The flame took hold quickly, curling the edges of the paper, eating through the images, dissolving the past into curling smoke. But one photograph she did not burn, the one of Henry standing between Nora and her teenage son, all three of them touched by sunlight. She held it carefully, smoothing the edges with her fingertips, and placed it in a drawer beside her wedding album, a quiet acknowledgement of the part of Henry's heart she had never known. As the last of the papers turned to ash in the fireplace, Helen sat back and watched the embers glow. The truth had been uncovered, faced, and finally laid to rest. Not erased, never erased, but placed gently where it could no longer harm. Outside, the winter wind rose softly against the windows, and inside, for the first time in many days, Helen felt a small measure of peace settle over her. She had discovered the whole man Henry had been, his flaws, his bravery, his sacrifices. And though the revelations had shaken the foundation of her memories, they had also given her something unexpected, a deeper understanding and a quiet pride in knowing that her husband's goodness had not just touched her life, but had saved others. In the soft glow of the dying fire, the house no longer felt silent or haunted. It felt lived in, honest, human. And Helen, holding the last photograph close, finally allowed herself to breathe again. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and keep watching the next videos. And don't forget to share this one with someone who loves a good story.